So, welcome back. We're this is we're getting into the middle of the book, and that's exciting. It's also at times this book is long and can be a bit grinding, and I hope these chapters and these pages were interesting. There's a lot of discussion of Adam Smith and Karl Marx and John Locke here. So it's important for us to sort of pay attention to that, but also to not lose track of what's really going on here and what Hannah Arendt is after. So just a quick reminder and recap. The book is asking after what's called the human condition. The human condition is understood as having three basic faculties or characteristics, which she says have characterized and have been the condition of a particularly human kind of life for a long time. Those are labor, work, and action. We are now trying to read through the last part of the labor section. In her mind, one of the great innovations of her book and of her analysis is what she calls this distinction between labor and work. Labor is the activity of our body through which we produce necessary things so that we can live. It's a kind of toil, and throughout history, we've wanted to overcome labor. Work, on the other hand, is an activity of the hands and of the brain, and it isn't a response to necessity. It's a response to the need for a human world, a lasting world, and thus a world of duration and in the end, freedom. The two central chapters or sections of this chapter are 13 and 14. We discussed 13 last week. Quickly, it's called Labor and Life. And the basic thesis of chapter 13 is that labor equals consumption equals life. Very clear. Now, that's an equation. It needs to be filled out, and I think we did so a bit last class. But the basic idea is that in laboring, we produce things that respond to necessities, whether it's bread or clothes or sustenance of any kind, and those things we produce are not meant to last. They're meant to be used to keep ourselves alive. And so we labor and we consume them, and it's part of what she calls a process of life. It is in Greek a zoological process. Zoological because it's connected to the life of man in his animal-like state. The confusion of modern terms is such that we today refer to that as biological, whereas for the Greeks, bios was a specifically human way of life, and Arendt argues that this is not a specifically human way of life to be under the processes of labor. So that was the arguments of chapter 13. Chapter 14, which is really a continuation of chapter 13, is called Labor and Fertility. And this chapter could simply be understood as the same as the last chapter, namely labor equals consumption equals life, with now the addition of the word fertility, to which will be added at the end of this chapter, happiness. The basic idea here is that Marx, like all great thinkers, has a fundamental contradiction running through his work, namely that on the one hand, he talks about how labor is an eternal necessity and is a response to eternal necessity. And on the other hand, Marx says that the revolution, the communist revolution, will free man from labor. And he says, and Arendt says, this is a fundamental contradiction in his work that has tried to be justified by most of Marxians. But the only way to really understand it is to understand that the revolution, which frees man from labor, is not actually is not actually core to the Marxist understanding. The core to Marxist understanding, and the most fundamental and foundational idea in his work, is that labor is raised to the highest rank, right? And this is how the chapter starts out. The first sentence of the chapter is the sudden spectacular rise of labor from the lowest, most despised position to the highest rank as the most esteemed of all human activities began when Locke discovered that labor is the source of all property. So she's here adding to her equation of labor equals consumption equals life equals fertility, this idea that labor, life, consumption, and fertility have also been raised to the highest levels and highest ranks. And that, of course, requires that certain other things be lowered. The other aims of life, human life, besides simply its continuity, its perseverance, its life, the good life, the moral life is one example, but also the great life, the life of action, the life of freedom is another, which is not the same as the good life. The other main idea introduced in this chapter, and it's an idea that we've probably mentioned once or twice, but will come to play an enormous role at the end of the book, is the idea of process and processes. So if you look at page 105, and near the bottom, you'll see that she says, historically, political theorists from the 17th century onward were confronted with a hitherto unheard of process of growing wealth. There was a process where wealth was growing, property was growing, acquisition was growing. And that they came to see this as a process that was, in a sense, natural. And she goes on a little below, from its beginning, this process, because of its apparent endlessness, namely, you can continue to grow wealth and accumulation endlessly, was understood as a natural process, and more specifically in the image of the life process itself. Namely, life grows. Human life, remember what she said, dies. It ends. Human life is not cyclical. It's linear. Human life has a beginning and an end, and what makes human life meaningful is the story of that human life from the beginning to the end. But the process of accumulation is endless and is cyclical. Money begets money. Power begets power. And life begets consumption, begets fertility, begets life in an unending process. And that is, for Arendt, the basic understanding of what it means to labor. And it is this, and what she's worried about, right, is how in raising labor, in raising labor in order to keep ourselves alive to the highest end, and thus consumption to the highest end, we reject those aspects of human life and human being which are not cyclical, which are individual, which are about action and spontaneity and memory and lastingness. And in a sense, we turn all life we turn the highest activity of human life into one of animal fertility. So that is very much, as I understand it, the argument of chapter 14. Chapters 15 and 16 are sort of specific inquiries into consequences of this idea of the rise of labor and its process-like character. Chapter 15 is called The Privacy of Property and Wealth. If you want, you can add in 2 words to that title, which will make it a little bit more understandable. It's the privacy of dead property and living wealth. And the point of this chapter, which again is quite complicated at times, is that property, and when we own property, we own something in the world, whether it's a house or a car or land, or a nice pen. And because it's in the world, we relate to other people through it. People know us through it. It becomes associated with who we are. And such property is directed both towards our private world. It's what separates us from the common world, and yet it also connects us to the common world. On the other hand, when we start to switch from a situation of property to a situation of growing wealth, right? And this is something we've talked about now 2 or 3 times during this text. And it's a distinction that for Hannah Arendt is obviously very important. The move from a property owning regime to a regime in which we own wealth and we acquire wealth. And for Arendt, she just talks about this primarily on pages 115 through 116 of the Human Condition here. Property, she says, protects us against the common on page 115. And yet, about 7 lines from the bottom, property does not strengthen, but rather mitigates the unrelatedness to the world of the laboring process. It mitigates the way in which labor, which is often very private, is unrelated to the world. Property connects us to the world because it gives us worldly security. If we turn to 116, she says, the matter becomes altogether different if the leading interest is no longer property, but the growth of wealth and the process of accumulation as such. This process can be as infinite as the life process of the species. So here's the move that she's making. If we've said in chapters 13 and 14 that life equals labor equals consumption equals fertility that is unending, property actually is inconsistent with unending labor. And so we need to replace labor with wealth, with the process of unending accumulation. That also means we need to replace individuals with socialized man so that wealth can continue past individual death, which is why man becomes social man, societal man, or Gattungswesen for Marx. She then talks about how Marx's labor philosophy is really to be understood as parallel to Darwin's philosophy of the origins of mankind. Mankind evolves in a process that follows natural laws. Similarly, labor and economy evolve according to processes that follow laws of accumulation and wealth that are disassociated from individual people and become part of a socialized emergence of a social sphere that is neither private or individual, nor public and political. I want to just focus then on the last couple sentences of this chapter, which are on 117 to 118. She writes at the bottom of 117, Marx predicted correctly, though with an unjustified glee, quote, the withering away, unquote, of the public realm under conditions of unhampered development of the productive forces of society. So if we socialize men and we create a biological process, right, we lose control over that process as men who can govern ourselves, and it becomes a natural scientific process that happens whatever we do. We can't really control it. And then she continues, and he was equally right, that is, consistent with his conception of man as an anima laborans, as a laboring animal, when he foresaw that socialized men who live in this social sphere of the process of labor, spend their freedom from laboring in those strictly private and essentially worldless activities that we now call hobbies. In other words, if you are part of a laboring society and you are able to support your life and the life of society without working all day, what do you do with your free time? And Marx had said, we will take up hobbies, tennis, golf, painting, etc. And the footnote, footnote 65, she says, in communist or socialist society, all professions would, as it were, become hobbies, right? All professions would become hobbies. You wouldn't actually become an artist or a painter or a lawyer or a professor, except to the extent that you find it to be fun, that it passes the time. Because there would be no painters, but only people who, among other things, spend their time on painting. You're not a painter, you're a laborer. You make money, you earn money, you labor, and then in your free time, you do things that are fun. This idea of the hobbyist is something that she is going to return to at numerous points in her text, most explicitly in section 17 on consumption, which we're going to get to in a second. So in chapter 16 on the instruments of work and the division of labor, Arendt is trying to do a few things. The first concerns the instruments of work. Now, and she's talking about a couple here. One is tools, right? We create tools, and tools help us lighten our load of labor. And so she begins by saying, well, if you lighten your load of labor too much, you lose a certain kind of your humanity, because part of the human condition is to labor. And so there's this constant struggle in history, where on the one hand, to be human, we want to free ourselves from labor so that we can pursue action and work. On the other hand, if we free ourselves too much from labor, we lose the vitality and liveliness that labor gives to us as human beings. So on page 120, near the bottom, right, that the life of the rich loses in vitality, in closeness to the good things of nature, what it gains in refinement, in sensitivity to the beautiful things in the world, has often been noted. The fact is that the human capacity for life in the world always implies an ability to transcend and to be alienated from the processes of life itself. Right? The human capacity for life in the world implies ability to transcend and be alienated from the processes of life, while vitality and liveliness can be conserved only to the extent that men are willing to take the burden, the toil and trouble of life upon themselves. So what she's saying is that while labor has traditionally been the lowest of the activities of life, and now it's the highest, we shouldn't forget that labor is important. Labor provides vitality and liveliness, and we need to always labor, which raises this question of the rise of tools. And she says robots, right? The next paragraph. It is true that the enormous improvement in our labor tools, the mute robots, with which Homo faber has come up to help the animal laborans, as distinguished from the human speaking instruments, namely slaves, whom the man of action had to rule and oppress when he wanted to liberate the animal laborans from its bondage, has made the twofold labor of life, the effort of its sustenance and the pain of giving birth, easier and less painful than it has ever been. Translated, we now have tools, robots, things, machines that make the sustenance of life easier and less painful than it has ever been. We can free ourselves from the curse of necessity, which is less vivid in our lives. But when we do that, she says, we risk losing freedom. So she says the danger here, this is a couple lines down, the danger here is obvious. Man cannot be free if he does not know that he is subject to necessity, right? Because his freedom is always won in his never wholly successful attempts to liberate himself from necessity. So this is maybe a controversial point. I assume it's a controversial point. The point is that if you live a life free from necessity, you're not free. You're luxurious. You have leisure in the sense that you can eat grapes all day. But freedom, to a certain degree, means freeing yourself from. And that the less necessity we actually encounter in our lives, the weaker the futility of freeing it from ourselves feels, and it requires less effort, and there is a reduction, she argues, in freedom. I wonder if that's something people agree with, right? The claim is here that if we were to be able to create a world in which we had to do almost no labor, where machines provided everything for us, we would be, quote unquote, free to do whatever we want. But Arendt is suggesting that we would lose the impulse towards freedom, and in a sense, freedom would become meaningless. Freedom is only meaningful if there's an impulse to free ourselves from necessity. And as necessity weakens, the impulse to freedom weakens. That seems to be the claim. I want to talk a little bit about chapter 17. So let's at least look at page 131, where Jack's question really comes from. And then let me see what I can do to answer it, or at least, if not answer it, speak to it, because I think it is an excellent question. So in the middle of page 131, she writes, and she's talking about Marx's utopia in which we would all have leisure to pursue hobbies like playing tennis or painting or reading Hannah Arendt, right? So it's exactly what Jack is asking about. And she writes, however, not even this utopia could change the essential worldly not even this utopia could change the essential worldly futility of the life process. the two stages through which the ever-recurrent cycle of biological life must pass, the stages of labor and consumption, may change their proportion, even to the point where nearly all human labor power is spent consuming, with the concomitant serious social problem of leisure, right, which is what Jack is asking about. That is essentially the problem of how to provide enough opportunity for daily exhaustion to keep the capacity for consumption intact. Now, she then offers a footnote to two different ideas of leisure, right? The old Greek idea of leisure, of skole, right? Which, importantly, given Jack's question, is the root of our word scholar or school. So that the leisure of skole was exactly as Jack said, the freedom from necessity, the conscious abstention from necessity and from consuming for political and religious pursuits. Versus what she talks about as the modern idea of leisure, which is the using of spare time to consume. Now, if you turn to the next pages, page 133, she says in the middle of the page, the hope that inspired Marx, and by the way, this is also the hope that Jack is here expressing, and the best men of the various workers' movements, that free time eventually will emancipate men from necessity and make the anima laborans productive, rests on the illusion of a mechanistic philosophy, which assumes that labor power, like any other energy, can never be lost, so that if it is not spent and exhausted in the drudgery of life, it will automatically nourish other higher activities. Namely, if we have free time because we don't have to labor, we can read Hannah Arendt. The guiding model of this hope in Marx was doubtless the Athens of Pericles, which in the future, with the help of the vastly increased productivity of human labor, would need no slaves to sustain itself, but would become a reality for all. And then here's her, at least response, I don't even want to say answer to Jack. 100 years after Marx, we know the fallacy of this reasoning. The spare time of the animal laborans is never spent in anything but consumption. And the more time left to him, the greedier and more craving his appetites. That these appetites become, and here's where we need to really think about what Jack is saying, that these appetites become more sophisticated, so that consumption is no longer restricted to the necessities, but on the contrary, mainly concentrates on the superfluities of life, does not change the character of this society, but harbors the grave danger that eventually no object of the world will be safe from consumption and annihilation through consumption. The question of freedom is raised explicitly by Arendt in the opening pages of chapter 17, A Consumer Society, and I wanted to return to that. We have about 5 or 6 minutes left, and I thought I'd at least point out some very important points here. So in chapter 17, she says, we live in a consumer society, which is the same as a society of laborers. And I hope that's become clear with this equation of life equals labor equals consumption. The point is, this is about 5 lines from the bottom of that page, 126. The point is not that for the first time in history, laborers were admitted and given equal rights in the public realm, but that we have almost succeeded in leveling all human activities to the common denominator of securing the necessities of life and providing for their abundance. Whatever we do, we are supposed to do for the sake of making a living, such is the verdict of society. And the number of people, especially in the professions, who might challenge it has decreased rapidly. So there are people who would challenge that, but the number of them has decreased. And she says, the only exception society is willing to grant. Now, this doesn't mean that it's the only exception. And it doesn't mean that all artists who we're about to talk about are actually exceptions. But she says the only exception society is willing to grant is the artist, who, strictly speaking, is the only worker left in a laboring society, namely someone who creates things that last. The same trend to level down all serious activities in the status of making a living is manifest in present-day labor theories, which define labor in opposition to play. As a result, all serious activities, irrespective of their fruits, are called labor, and every activity which is not necessary either for life of the individual or for the life process is subsumed under playfulness. In these theories, which by echoing the current estimate of a laboring society on the theoretical level sharpen it and drive it into its inherent extreme, not even the work of the artist is left. It is dissolved into play and has lost its worldly meaning. The playfulness of the artist is felt to fulfill the same function in the laboring life process of society as the playing of tennis or the pursuit of a hobby fulfills in the life of the individual. And one could add, potentially, reading Hannah Arendt, right? The point here is that in opposing seriousness to playfulness, freedom becomes understood as playfulness. And that's the point she makes in footnote 75, right? Where she says, for modern thinking, this is 4 lines in, playfulness has become the source of freedom. And so this, I think, really does go back to the question Jack is asking, and it's a absolutely essential question. Are we reading Hannah Arendt playfully, or as freely, in the sense of playful, in the sense of it's not our serious work, but it's something we do on the side? Or is Hannah Arendt and reading it what's most important, and we labor on the side in order to allow us to read Hannah Arendt and do what's important? That's the question Hannah Arendt is really pushing us to ask. And what she worries about is that in the elevation of labor and the idea that someone who would spend their lives just reading Hannah Arendt and begging or working in a restaurant in order to pay enough to live in a hovel so that they could read Hannah Arendt would be considered by most people unserious. Whereas the person who works and does quite well and has some extra time and reads Hannah Arendt on the side is considered to be playing and not being serious. Now, that may not be right for that person. She's not saying that nobody is serious in reading Hannah Arendt. You guys all may be. What she's saying is society doesn't recognize it. A laboring society doesn't recognize it.